Welcome to the Shadow Warrior podcast. Today we have episode 98, which is titled Medicine and AI Lessons from One for the Other and for India. And I'm really delighted to welcome on board Dr. Abhishek Puri. Hello, Abhishek. Thank you for taking the time to join us here. Let me give you a little bit of his background. He's given a very brief version. Abhishek is a radiation oncologist with an interest in AI and healthcare policy. He blogs and tweets at www.radonknotes.com and tweets as Radonk Notes. That's Radiation Oncologist Notes. So thank you. It's been a pleasure working with you to put this presentation together that's been published in Open Magazine. So without further ado, let me just share the screen and we can take this forward. Okay, we have a few slides to go through. Okay, here we are. Share, and I'll do a slideshow. Okay, so title slide, and now we'll move on to the next slide, which is what we see going on in this world. Okay, because unless you've been hiding under a rock, you must know about ChatGPT, which pretty much took the world by storm. And its rival, the ChatGPT, is basically from Microsoft and a startup company called OpenAI. And then, not to be left behind, Google has come up with this thing called Bard AI. But bottom line is that both these are mechanisms that are able to capture enormous amount of text from the internet. And based on that, it'll generate new text and give you answers in a way that's very human readable, because it writes text that's very convenient for us to consume. So it's probably the fastest adoption of any technology. I think it's like 100 million people started using it within like a week or so of ChatGPT coming to market. But moving on, we're going to be talking primarily about the world of medicine and how some of the learnings from that world can be applied to the world of AI. So here we have, images depicting both Ayurveda and allopathy. And it looks like in reality, the two are in competition. Although, to be honest, it'd be much better if they were more in synergy and there is a little bit of give and take on that front between traditional Indian medicine and Western medicine, which I'd like to call allopathy here, just so that we don't use terms like, Western modern medicine. It's just another mechanism of medicine. So what are your thoughts on this, between Ayurveda and allopathy and how they could coexist and collaborate and so on?
Sir, thank you very much for having me on the show. I am an allopathic doctor, so of course I can't speak from the perspective of an Ayurvedic doctor. Both of them are different specializations. But what is important that we need to realize is that allopathy depends on the reductionist point of view. That is, they try to drill down everything to the basic, common basic thing, and then try to cure the symptoms. Whereas in case of Ayurveda, it cures the person, it cures the cause. So Ayurveda looks at the holistic point of view, whereas the allopathic perspective drills down to the or tries to attempt to cure the uh, thing which is causing the symptom.
Right.
So this is the basic difference.
Right. And in fact, when we were discussing this, we did talk about things like, customized medicine, genetic-based medicine, where in fact the Western ideas are moving a little bit closer to treating the individual based on their specificities rather
That's right.
than in more general terms. Good. So hopefully we will find at some point there is really custom medicine that is meant for you rather than for 70% of the people. Now moving on,
That's right.
yeah, that would be a good outcome. Moving on, let's take another look here. So this is going back to the ChatGPT and other AI outcomes at this point. So this is something that is from the Gartner Group of Management Consultancy, and they talk about hype. That is, almost anything new that comes out of the technology industry attracts an enormous amount of hype. And unfortunately, it goes through a predictable cycle where people get extremely excited, which is the peak of inflated expectations there. And then they find out that, well, it's not quite as good as we thought it was. And to some extent, that's happening, I believe, with ChatGPT. We're at this point very much at the peak of inflated expectations. You put some arrows around this to show what might happen, and also what might happen once you get into the trough of disillusionment. Well, can you
Yes.
expand on that?
Yes, that's right. I am reminded about the idea of so-called semantic search when it was proposed in early 2000s. And there were a flurry of activity and a lot of PhDs came out, but then suddenly the VCs lost interest and shifted towards the so-called natural language processing. Then, as you have mentioned over here, the chatbots and the autonomous vehicles, everybody was expecting that the Ubers of the world will pick up the people from the doorsteps and drop them wherever they are. But then we realized that uh, Tesla, for example, which has implemented the computer vision in a large scale, has not met with the desired expectations and leaves the vehicles vulnerable for any kind of malicious activity as well. So the hype that goes that yes, we are going to have flying vehicles has never materialized as what was prophesied earlier. So
Right,
likewise in the healthcare as well, where everybody jumps on the personalized medicine bandwagon, but they really don't understand what it takes to cure the person as a whole. I'll discuss on that later.
right, right. But one example of something that was really inflated is metaverse, isn't it? And last year that
Yes.
was everybody's darling. But the reality is this, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
they spent a huge amount of money trying to figure out what exactly it is, uh, pushing their virtual reality or the so-called augmented reality and creating some digital avatars. But then, who wants to deal with what Zuckerberg has to offer? I
right,
mean, ultimately, maybe it was way ahead of its time.
right,
Microsoft had to wind down its HoloLens, for example.
right. So we see this cycle all over again, right? So it's entirely possible that ChatGPT and Bard and so forth will suffer from this. But anyway, let's move on, back to the whole question of medicine, because if you look at the effects of allopathy in particular, okay, this is the outcome. You see, there is a general improvement in life expectancy for both men and women all over the world. And I would say it's a genuine medical miracle, isn't it? So I guess you could give a lot of
Yes.
credit to allopathy, but also some other factors, right? That you have mentioned. How would you like to expand on that?
Yes, of course. Um, we had a good victory over the infectious diseases. The public health
Hmm.
took care of the hygiene part. The water was cleaned up.
Right.
But if you see that was for the communicable diseases, and then the vaccines were discovered and then mass manufactured. Polio was or is completely eradicated almost across the world. Smallpox was completely eradicated. In fact, there's a bit of interesting history that how, despite the Cold War, the Russians and the Americans they collaborated to completely eliminate the smallpox in
Hmm.
70s.
Hmm.
So that's indeed a medical miracle.
Right.
But if you see the non-communicable diseases like cancer, we have actually reached a plateau.
Hmm.
So that's again a topic for another day. But
Hmm.
yes, there is a remarkable improvement in the life expectancy across the world.
Right. But as you said, it is plateauing. I saw this diagram recently. it's kind of startling. It's saying that especially in rich countries, there has been a fall in the life expectancy, especially in the US, pretty bad. And even if you adjust for COVID, which was an extraordinary situation, it appears that life expectancy growth has come to an end. And that's startling, especially if you look at the next slide here, which talks about how there is an enormous amount of inflation in healthcare costs. As you can see here, right? Costs have gone up like mad, but that still doesn't show up in improvement in health outcomes. Why is that?
Yes, this can be boiled down to the wasteful American bureaucracy. The health outcomes in the US, despite the massive investments, they have not really improved. Statistically, US has the lowest life expectancy amongst the OECD countries, that is 78.8 years, and the highest infant mortality rate, 5.8 deaths per thousand live births out of
Hmm.
the so-called
Hmm.
global north.
Hmm.
And even though the number of physicians, that is 2.6 physicians and 11.1 nurses per thousand, is comparable to anybody else.
Right.
So it's kind of a dichotomy as to whether investments really lead to improved outcomes.
Right. And this is the health spending. It's a little bit hard to see, but in reality, the US has outspent everybody else. Now, the question that people may ask is this only a problem with the US with its, laissez-faire capitalistic health system? But the data seems to suggest that even in a socialist system, say the British system, we're beginning to see that it's falling apart, right?
That's right. In NHS, the National Health Service is considered almost as a religion, and British they rely heavily on that. Last heard that they spend almost 40% of the total tax collected onto the NHS services, and
Wow.
the cost is increasing manifold.
Hmm. Yet,
But
yeah,
yet the outcomes are almost same.
yeah. And people are complaining. I mean, I have relatives who complain about how long they have to wait for, even relatively minor things like minor surgery. And so healthcare is really not as abundant and available in the socialized NHS systems as well. Um, and the other aspect of it, we talked about it. There is this belief that in the UK, with its, as you said, 40% expenditures on the National Health Service, they still have had 250,000 people who died sooner than they should have if their healthcare systems were in good shape. So I guess we could say that on average, allopathic medical systems around the world have probably reached a certain plateau that is uh, they've got all the low-hanging fruit, and now it's getting more and more difficult to offer good health care and keep the entire population um, healthy. Now, this also brings up a completely different perspective, which is the issue of medical orthodoxy, okay, which potentially is unwilling to change. And we talked about uh, poor Ignaz Semmelweis, right? The sad story of Ignaz Semmelweis in the, I don't know, 1850s or something. You want to talk a little bit about him, Abhishek?
Yeah, I mean, he had noticed a very interesting correlation. He found that if there is a washing of the hands, the obstetric or the maternity deaths, they are reduced. So basically, what he could not discover or describe verbally was that the so-called germ theory of disease. And he came across or he came up with a very stodgy medical bureaucracy which was not willing to change or listen to his perspective because he was not a doctor. He happened to observe. And so much so that he got completely disillusioned and had to be put in a mental asylum. But it's a opening lesson for doctors and physicians that we need to be open up to the ideas of empiricism. That is, if the observational characteristics of what you see or the events that you see and you're able to describe them, that they end up producing some kind of result, we need to be open to those ideas at least.
Right,
So
right,
this is a very important lesson for us.
right,
I'm talking from a medical perspective.
right, right. So what's happened here is pretty much that Semmelweis observed correlation between washing hands and lower maternal mortality in obstetrics wards. But he wasn't able to come up with a theoretical explanation. And so the doctors at the time poo-pooed him. So here we come across the crucial idea of correlation versus causation. It's not enough to say, X happens and Y happens, therefore the two are related. They may not be related. It could be spurious correlation, unless you're able to come up with a clear example or a clear causal relationship that says, because X happened, this is the reason why it also caused Y to happen. So I asked our good friend ChatGPT to come up with what causation and correlation mean. Okay, so it explains. I thought it is useful, since we were saying rude things about ChatGPT, to ask it to defend itself to some extent. And in fact, this is not a bad description. And yeah, as we discussed earlier, it does produce readable, useful stuff. And what it's saying here is, stochastic, that is statistical relationships, may not be causal or deterministic. If it's a causal thing, it's deterministic in the sense that we know A causes B. So if A happens, B will happen. Whereas in the stochastic relationship, what we're saying is, well, X and Y happened together, so probably they'll always happen together. That may or may not be true. So here is ChatGPT's summary of this. But the other side of it is what we wrote in our article, right? See, ChatGPT
Yes,
sounds articulate, right? But it really doesn't know what it is, what it's all about. So it really doesn't know. It doesn't understand, right? So it,
that's right. It
yeah,
it only generates things out of not only a large language model, what we call as a large language model, but it generates plausible sounding sentences based on the statistical probability and conforming to the grammatical rules. This is the easiest explanation that I have come across, or I have tried to distill down a very complex mathematical formulation to create the entire structure.
right,
So it generates a plausible sounding thing. It appears to sound very factual, but it is not,
right,
because it conforms to the existing grammar as we speak and as we understand,
right,
but is not necessarily correct.
right. It only has a probability of being correct. It's likely to be
Exactly. And
correct, but not necessarily correct. And that, in fact, is also the problem with allopathy, right? Because the way drugs and, the gold standard of, what is it, RCT? What does RCT stand for? Uh,
randomized control trials.
Randomized control trials of drugs. Basically, if 70% of the people who take the drug get cured, you accept it as a drug for that disease, right? So my question is, what happens if you unfortunately fall into the 30% on which the drug doesn't work? You're kind of out of luck, especially because you don't know that you're in the 30%, right? So the same issue of probabilistic natures in both the AI context and in the allopathy context means that there is no guarantee, right? So that's the main issue that we have been concerned about in this article. It's probable that the next word is going to be this, according to the algorithm, but it's not always necessarily the case. And it also means that
Yes.
sometimes these chatbots, the generative AI, produces stuff that's completely insane. It makes up stuff, right? We talked about how we observed a chess game where the opponent was also a program which played properly, but every time the chat GPT robot lost a piece, it just basically materialized it elsewhere on the board. That's obviously crazy behavior, but that's the sort of thing that we have to be worried about. And in fact, it's reaching such a point that I think a couple of days ago, some number of luminaries in the field said that this is a dangerous device and we don't want to put it out there without some regulation. So let's put a moratorium on generative AI research for the next 6 months. So there are some concerns about it. And our good friend Rajiv Malhotra, who's a polymath, but he did do something very interesting maybe 2 or 3 years ago. 2 years ago, I think he wrote this book on AI and the future of power, and he made it pretty much applicable to India. Did you have some thoughts on that book?
Yes, I was lucky to read that. In this book, he describes 5 battlegrounds and discusses in detail the dangers of sitting on the sidelines. Mr. Malhotra has referred to the big tech as a new East India company and even coined the term called as data capitalism. That how the data that is being captured will hamper the Indian economic growth. And he also outlined a number of recommendations, especially for the big tech, so that people, especially who are interested in our anthropomorphological data.
Mm.
And he also mentioned about the fact that we need to create data outload curves before we understand the complete context. So I would say that out of all his works, this one is very important and a very seminal work that he has done this time.
Right, right. And so, everybody talks about data being the new oil, and it's absolutely literally true in this context where if we lose our data, especially the data that is kind of locked up, in Indian languages, nobody's interested in looking that up, but the moment it's translated and put out there, somebody's going to grab it. So it's a little scary. Now, I was talking to somebody who's in the AI world, and they said there is open source large language models. There's something called Llama from Meta, for example. So the open source models are there, but the problem is populating it and training it with data that is text that's contextual and appropriate to India. So that's a huge effort, and I don't even know if any Indian entity is pursuing that. The fact is that you don't need enormous computing power. You can run these language models, these open source models on modest computing platforms, but capturing the text and the traditional Indian knowledge is a key activity. Okay, so that I hope somebody is working on that. Now, that brings me to something completely different, again, related to the issue of correlation versus causation. This professor at Stanford, he is an he's a primatologist, actually, and he studies humans as primates. And he made a very interesting observation that, anything you see in human behavior is affected by so many parameters that a correlation kind of approach simply won't work, because there are, you may not pick up the correct independent variables, all the correct independent variables, and in fact, you may not pick up any of them, right? So that's worth thinking about in terms of the issue between correlation and causation. Okay, and then one more thing, I just read this yesterday, that ChatGPT caused this person, not ChatGPT, Eliza, a generative AI, influenced this person. So it's like putting a loaded gun in somebody's hands. It made his paranoia worse, and the guy committed suicide. So we do have to be careful. We need to have some regulation. It's like guns are controlled and regulated. We probably need to have similar regulatory mechanisms for generative AI as well. This is a stray event, but I think it could recur. Okay.
Yes, I would just like to add one thing that this company had trained the entire chatbot based on ChatGPT 1, the first version model,
Okay.
and tried to create some kind of reinforcement learning through human moderators. But somehow, once the person could, they latched on, they assumed that the chatbots had assumed human personalities and they got connected to it.
Hmm.
And it's a very unfortunate incident which happened. So this is
Yeah.
going to get accelerated if it is not controlled and regulated.
Right. Right. It's pretty dangerous. Well, in its own defense, we Abhishek asked ChatGPT to summarize our article. So how well do you think it did?
I would say that it did highlight some of the important points that we had or we have just discussed. But what I noted in the entire, I created 10 points. What I noted in the entire discussion that the word Ayurveda itself was missing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Okay.
this is where I would just like to come back to what Mr. Rajiv Malhotra had mentioned, that the complete Indic systems will be eliminated if we don't control this ourselves. So, because generative AI appears to create so-called factual statements, this is not a very encouraging trend. So I have copied the entire summary as it is, and you can see that the word Ayurveda is completely missing. So this is one observation.
Right.
There's no Ayurveda there. And
Right.
it does not even mention that Ayurveda could do anything.
Right. Right. And
So
in the article itself, we did mention Ayurveda multiple times.
exactly.
Right.
So I don't think that we can rely on it blindly. It gives you some idea or some semblance, but it is not the truth. And
Right.
completely eliminates the central point of discussion that we are trying to put,
Right.
that
Right.
instead of deterministic or the rationalist approach, we need to adopt a holistic approach towards treatment.
Right. So in other words, ChatGPT actually missed the point in the article
Absolutely,
in summarizing it. So
absolutely.
this is part of the danger that we have been concerned about. So I think with that will wind up. And I really thank you, Abhishek, for coming on board and actually working with me. We spent a long time together putting this article
Yes,
together, and it was a good experience. So hopefully we'll do more of these. And once again, thank you and good
thank
day.
you.
Namaste.
Namaskar.
Okay, so I'll now turn